From Washington, Diplomacy and Global Affairs in Conversations with Nicholas Kroloff.
On the program today, we take a look at some of the best moments of our first season, with what our guests had to say about modern diplomacy, work and life in the Foreign Service, and why any of us should care about what diplomats do. Stay tuned.
Support for Conversations with Nicholas Kroloff comes from these sponsors and viewers like you. To contribute, visit nicholaskroloff.com.
Why should average Americans care about diplomacy? How does it affect the lives of ordinary people?
Well, I think diplomacy, when it's done right, contributes in a very significant way to what matters most to Americans, to their prosperity and to their physical security. Jobs for Americans depend more than ever before in our history on exports, on trade, on investment overseas, on attracting foreign tourists to this country, which helps create jobs here. And so in that sense, the work that diplomats do in our embassies overseas, as well as in Washington, to help American companies create opportunities like that, leads directly to more jobs in this country and to higher economic growth. In terms of physical security, whether you're dealing with a threat posed by terrorists or the proliferation of nuclear weapons or other kind of weapons of mass destruction, or whether you're dealing with newer kinds of physical threats, whether it's infectious diseases or climate change, the work of diplomats is really important and far cheaper, in a sense, in terms of American taxpayer resources than when we're driven to use the U.S. military. As enormously capable as it is, it makes a lot more sense to try to avoid and prevent situations where the U.S. military might have to be engaged through diplomacy than it does to have to resort to the use of force, which really ought to be the last option.
We have to do a better job now going out and explaining to Americans what it is we do overseas, why we do it, what's the return on investment. After all, the taxpayer is the Board of Governors here.
Diplomacy is perhaps both the art and the science of managing the assets of a nation, bringing them all to bear to manage international relations, if you want to define it, very, very broadly. So it means knowing when to bring economic power, military power, cultural, social, economic power to bear, or which combination or mix of all of those things in different situations. And I think, as former Secretaries of State have noted, including Secretary Baker, who very eloquently laid this out last year, I think, on the occasion of the sort of launch of the U.S. Diplomacy Center and Museum of American Diplomacy, that diplomacy has, in fact, played an important role in American history. From the War of Independence through Louisiana Purchase, through Seward's Folly, Alaska. You can go through American history, of course, Marshall and World War II, and see times in which diplomacy has made a real contribution to national security, national prosperity, right, and to the nation's well-being.
Sports is a way to engage foreign public. It's a way that you can connect people all over the world. There are many ways that when you leave a room full of youngsters and you can see the brightness in their eyes and how they're inspired by your story, or how you might answer some of the questions that they might have. Because traveling as an envoy, you really understand that you're telling your story, my American story. The things, even in sports, the things I've learned.
Right.
And you hope that you can make a big impact in their lives.
What do you think the Foreign Service should or will look like in 5 or 10 years? In other words, what's your main priority as Director General of the Foreign Service long term?
Wow, that's an amazingly difficult question. It's always hard
10 seconds.
to predict the future. But I would like a Foreign Service with officers who commit themselves to a full career. We're having officers come in who are testing us out for 5 years, and this is not a place to test out your career options. We want people who are committed to the Foreign Service, and we'd like to see a Foreign Service with employees who are happy. We look at people who are flexible, people who know how to make decisions, people who are creative and people who are innovative, who can think on their feet. So you can't train people necessarily to do those kinds of skills. They have to have it in them. So that's part of our recruitment. But then we train,
testing, right?
And testing.
Right.
And then the training part, we can teach them how to issue visas. We can teach them how to issue passports. We can teach them negotiation skills. We can teach them writing skills and speech making. Those kinds of skills we can teach them. But it requires also some inner skills that can't be taught.
I joined the Foreign Service in order to see the world, in order to learn as much about the world as possible and make a contribution to my own country's security as I did it. Part of the attraction for the Foreign Service for me is that I think I don't have the attention span, measured either in minutes or in years, to focus on a single task and a single topic for an entire career. I have great admiration for people who can do that, whether they are in science or academics or diplomacy, any place in government. But that's not me. And so knowing that over the course of a career, I can both have continuity in the career and at the same time look forward every 2 or 3 years to a new challenge, an opportunity to learn something new, an opportunity to take skills and knowledge I developed on one job and apply them in a new job. To me, that's the exciting part of the career.
The Foreign Service for decades had been, if you pardon the phrase, a white man's preserve. African Americans, Latinos, women, ethnics generally were either unwelcome, made to feel unwelcome, or marginalized. Now that was changing in 1977, but the change was just beginning. The Foreign Service today is a much fairer, better, more effective institution. Let me give you an example. America is a universal nation. We're composed of every nationality in the world. We have native speakers of every language in the world, just about.
Which is why the government wants to make the Foreign Service look more like America.
Well, it looks a lot more like America than it used to, I can tell you that. But it didn't when I came in, ethnics were regarded with some disdain. The notion that we had a comparative advantage and could hire native speakers of whatever language you could think of was regarded as questionable personnel policy. Issues of so-called dual loyalty came up. Would they really be loyal Americans, or would they feel a loyalty to their ancestors' homeland? Practice has demonstrated that this is silly.
Right. And currently there are many Foreign Service officers who actually were born in other countries.
Exactly. And they serve with wonderful effectiveness.
I grew up in a little farm town called Level Plains, Alabama. It's in the southeast corner of the state. Never even dreamed of leaving the state of Alabama growing up. In fact, I had always had this dream of maybe if I did leave the state, I was going to go to Nashville and manage the Grand Ole Opry. But I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Alabama. I got my business degree. And my very first job right out of college was working for a freight company in Birmingham. It was called Carolina Freight Carriers Corporation. And I went to work as a labor and sales manager with a bunch of Teamster guys. It was a great learning experience for me. I did that for a couple of years, met my great wife, Jennifer, who was a broadcast journalist. And we went from there, we made the decision to go on to Ghana, where I was a hospital administrator. I took the exam, like I said. I was fortunate enough to pass. And then I went on to take the oral assessment, and I have an accent, in case you can't tell. And I remember being all worked up about, oh, am I going to stand out? Because I thought everybody came from the East Coast or the West Coast, and how is this boy from Alabama going to make it? And they were given the oral assessment in Dallas, Texas. So I signed up to go to Dallas, and I went there, and it was quite an intense experience. But it was a positive one, and passed the exam there, and then was on a waiting list for many, many months, it seemed like.
There are a lot of spouses in the Foreign Service who do give up a career or put a career on hold and end up following the spouse who has joined. But there's a lot of spouses now who are really having mobile careers, and it's exciting to see the way couples are working together to find places that fit for the both of them. And whether the spouse is working at the embassy or outside of the embassy or doing a telework job or doing consulting, there are really a lot of ways now that are available to make things work, more so than there ever were before. We move a lot, so everything that you own gets put in boxes. Everywhere that you go that is new, you have to figure out the new school for the kids and see if their credits from the previous school match up with what they're facing now. Kids who have to say goodbye to friends, whether they are living in, Morocco or Ghana or Chennai or here, they've had to say goodbye to people over and over and over again, and that's really hard.
One of the deficiencies, if I may say so, of the current system that you and I have talked about before, and of course I talked to hundreds of Foreign Service officers during the research for my book, is the lack of proper professional development in the Foreign Service and the still insufficient training. As better as it may be compared to 10 or 12 years ago, it still is not at the level it should be. And these very bright and capable people coming into the Foreign Service, about whom you just talked, many of them come from very different fields. They've never done foreign policy, foreign affairs, or diplomacy. And many of them have told me they come in and they don't know exactly what they will be doing. They don't know what an embassy does, what their particular section will be doing. And they also tell me that they would like more preparation before they go. And just generally over the course of a diplomat's career, it would help if there was a structured, proper development and formation of diplomats. What would it take for that to happen?
Well, first, I agree with you, and I think we can learn a lot of important lessons from the U.S. military and the way in which the military, whatever branch of service, invests in its people and looks at the whole course of a career and the kind of skills that people need to develop in order to succeed and do their jobs well. And I think part of the problem has been in the past just having enough people so that you have the space that you can actually allow for training opportunities without having vacancies at different posts around the world. We went through a stretch of several years in the 1990s where we had no intake of new Foreign Service officers, and we paid a price for that. In recent years, especially during Hillary Clinton's tenure, we were very fortunate. She worked very hard to get the resources required to bring in more Foreign Service officers. That's given us the space for more serious systematic training programs. And so I think we're making progress, but we still have a ways to go. Because one of the things I think we need to do is to emphasize to officers the importance of taking advantage of those training opportunities. In the past, a lot of the culture has been that, well, you don't really do those things. You want to go from job to job, and that's what's going to get you ahead. And I think we need to make clear the significance in people's career of taking advantage of those training opportunities at the beginning of a career, but also at the mid-level and the senior levels as well. Because a lot of times, especially in the post-9/11 decade, very junior officers are getting thrown into situations of enormous responsibility, whether it's managing programs of millions of dollars, for which they may not have a lot of experience, or situations involving a lot of physical risks too. And in both of those kind of circumstances, you want to make sure people are equipped to do their jobs well and to succeed.
We think that because of the big diversity of backgrounds, academic and otherwise, that people bring when they enter, we really need to think seriously about having something more than a short orientation course, the A100, the 5 weeks. That people really need an introduction to the profession of diplomacy that's more like 5 or 6 months, and noting that many countries do a year or 2 in their diplomatic academies and institutions.
We have a global foreign policy, and we are looking at developing our leaders, diplomatic and foreign policy leaders, over a 20, 25, 30-year career span. So we want people to master the specifics of an individual job early on, but then as they grow and develop, we want them to understand the inner relationships, the complexity of diplomacy in this century and the next one, so that they will understand how the work they're doing in one country relates to what we're trying to achieve around the world. When we look ahead to the challenges that are going to be facing our country and the skill sets that our people will need, we focus on, first, advocacy to make sure that people are working to represent American interests, but also analysis and strategy, understanding what's really going on around the world and developing a strategy to make sure that we have the right kind of outcome that protects both American interests but also those of our friends and allies. So our platform at FSI, our strategic enabler, is designed to make sure that people have the full range that they need. They need to understand issues like global health and global energy, human trafficking. But they also have to have culture, history, mastery of foreign languages, and most importantly, they need to be leaders. They need to look to our role in the world and help us lead our way forward. So that's what we're trying to do. They have to respond quickly to change and changing circumstances, but they all know that what they are about is America, keeping America safe, taking our interests forward. And so that's really at the core of American diplomacy.
Is there anything fundamental about the way diplomats do things compared to the way soldiers do things? Mentality, operational readiness, how they attack a problem?
Well, you know, we in the military pride ourselves in building a plan, and then aggressively executing that plan. We know that that plan is going to change over time, but we want to have the agility to adapt to it. We're very focused, but that's not necessarily the way that the diplomats do it. The diplomats, and rightfully so, what I learned from them was through developing a relationship, the same objective is accomplished, but it's not so much the United States accomplishing the objective as the diplomat learns to help and mentor the indigenous host nation counterpart to gain ownership of that idea, and then through their own capacity and capabilities to accomplish the objective, which is really, in the end, almost more effective, because if they gain ownership and pride in the fact that they were able to accomplish the objective rather than some other person doing it for them, then they're going to take more ownership of it. And if they take more ownership of it, then it becomes more institutionalized in the end.
How does intelligence, either gathering or other operations that have to do with intelligence, affect U.S. diplomacy on a daily basis?
Well, first, let me say that these are not totally discrete and totally different activities. After all, a diplomat is, if you will, an overt intelligence collector. When you do diplomatic reporting on political or economic matters, you are collecting intelligence and information in an overt fashion. You're not collecting it clandestinely. That's the difference between an intelligence operation and a diplomatic operation. An intelligence operation is collecting that information in a secret manner. But the end product can at times be very much the same. And certainly the analytic component is similar. So that if you think of intelligence, I have a kind of a one-sentence definition of intelligence. Intelligence is the collection and analysis of information for the purposes of statecraft. And when you think about that part, it becomes clear that it's related to diplomacy. And as an ambassador, as a Foreign Service officer, I spent a lot of time trying to analyze critical situations, and I worked very closely with my colleagues in the intelligence community to share notes, share impressions with them about these very same situations.
The profession of diplomacy, it's a very unusual profession in that there are people practicing it who are not really trained to be professional diplomats. There are people from academia, from law, from other walks of life that come in as political appointees at the State Department and other agencies, and they practice diplomacy. I suppose, having been one of those people, in fact, you served at the Pentagon, you served at the State Department, you served at the National Security Council, you wouldn't perhaps be against such a practice. But what do we need to keep in mind in order for U.S. diplomacy to be successful? What kind of people do we need to look for, in fact, to be in those positions?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for training diplomats. And having a professional foreign service gives you people who are better skilled in many instances in trying to adjust the interests of among countries and to accomplish our goals and pursue our interests. But we have a long tradition in the United States of mixing professionals with, or career diplomats with amateurs. And there's something to be said for a little admixture of amateurs. Sometimes they can add a dimension which is quite important. Other times they're simply political hacks who can make a mess of things. But in the American tradition, I think we could do a little bit more on professional diplomacy.
I think that there's been a kind of increasing and constant growth in the degree to which political appointments have been expanded.
To reward people for?
I think partly to reward people, partly because of insecurity when they come in about the Foreign Service, whether it will serve their interests or some other interests. A sense that in each election we have all the right ideas, they had all the bad ideas. Those people, the professionals, serve them. How can they serve us? There are inherent contradictions here that have to be examined as part of the system. They would be even more inherently contradictory if, in fact, the Foreign Service became partisan, or if the Foreign Service didn't speak up and more serious mistakes were made for lack of in-depth knowledge, for background, and for understanding. And so the presidents need to know that the Foreign Service is at their disposition, that it will, I hope, always tell the truth to power, but it also is committed, as the military service is, to follow orders once policy decisions are made and to carry those out, to constantly report on what's going on. And as an ambassador, I felt my primary responsibility to the President and the Secretary of State through the Secretary was to give policy advice when I thought policy advice was necessary.
We think that for a great nation and a great democracy, which we think the United States is, we should not be involved in the selling of government offices. And so the bundling and the rewarding of people with ambassadorships for campaign contributions should stop. That should not be the criteria. The criteria really needs to be other professional qualifications that they can bring to strengthen American diplomacy writ large. And yes, you're correct. We're a smaller percentage along the lines of what Vice President Gore had once suggested of 10%. And I have spoken with other political appointees, thoughtful political appointees, who've said, yes, if it gets too big, it's counterproductive. It weakens the institution, who then can't support the top political leadership as well as we need it to.
Right. We still are the most influential country in the world. Everyone has a view of the United States, and everyone wants the United States either to do something or not to do something. Egypt is one case, Syria is another.
And that is all for our first season. I'm grateful to all our guests who took the time to visit with us and offer their views and analysis on the practice of diplomacy. Thank you very much indeed for watching. See you next time.